Hello, it's James Harding. We're recording this episode in front of a live audience here at the KITE Festival at Abbey Road Studios from Tortoise. Welcome to the news meeting. Thank you very much. A very live audience, and to help me try and make sense of the news this week, what's leading and what should be leading the news, I'm joined by Chloe Hadjimatheou, one of our reporters here, who's most recently reported on a story that's gone completely uncovered, i.e. the race to be the next Ayatollah in Iran. Perhaps we'll talk about things related to that, Chloe. I'm joined too by our data editor, Katie Riley. Katie, how are you?
Hello. Good.
Good, good. And I'm very excited to introduce the author and journalist Oliver Kamm. We worked at the Times together. He was the leader writer on economics, a columnist at the Times, has written books on the use of the English language, on the mind, and I am delighted that you're here with us. Thank you for joining us, Oliver.
Pleasure, James.
Right, we are at the KITE Festival at Abbey Road. We are sitting in Studio 2. You'll hear an excitement in our voices. You might even hear that tremor excitement from the audience too. It's quite an extraordinary place to be. Just to give you a feel for it, we're sitting here looking at the pianos upon which the Beatles recorded some of their most important tracks. Just about 6 yards from where I'm sitting, John Lennon decided that they would plug the guitar straight into the desk and see what it sounded like if they did that. And the spirit of this festival is what if? What if we try and do things differently? What if we try and think a little bit differently? And perhaps we should take that spirit to the news. So, Chloe, why don't you go first? Long story short, what's yours?
I know we shy away from anniversary stories at Tortoise, but I'm going to pitch October 7th and October 8th, 1 year on.
Oliver, what's yours?
Eclipse of Empire, referring to the preliminary agreement to cede sovereignty over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
Oh, okay. Katie?
Mine is your favorite artist's favorite artist hates being your favorite artist.
Well, I think that's obvious to everyone except me. So why don't we start with you, Katie? What's that story?
No. Okay, that was not my intention. So who sitting up here knows who Chappell Roan is? She won the Grammy this year for Best New Artist. She had one of the biggest sort of hit songs of the summer. She played at Lollapalooza in Chicago. She played at Coachella. And she is 26 years old, but she signed with Atlantic when she was 17, so she's been a professional artist for about a decade, but she's never been famous before. Until about 6 or 9 months ago, she was just a normal person. And in the last 6 to 9 months, she has been sort of on her TikTok especially, but also her other social media accounts, kind of documenting her descent or ascent into sort of extreme fame, but also her descent into everything that comes with that. And I wanted to talk in this space about how we have not sort of grappled with the way that the internet and social media and everybody having a smartphone and an iPhone in their pocket and recording everybody around them at all times has changed fame.
So let's just talk about a few things, because we did talk about Chappell Roan at one of our news conferences. And I can't remember whether it was after Coachella or Lollapalooza. She'd had this gig which had been huge, and then suddenly everyone was talking about her. Mm-hmm. But this story, if I get it right, Katie, is not about that. It's about her stepping back from social media, political comment, particularly given, I think, Taylor Swift, Billie Eilish, others have come out, to support Kamala Harris. So what's the reason why she's stepping back? Is it personal, or is it a comment on fame?
So I think, this is not. I mean, it's an interesting question about sort of like the entire political side of this, right? But what I'm more interested in personally is sort of the way that fame and the internet has made extreme fame almost inhumane to the people who sort of find themselves in that position. There's a very small sort of club of, there is a relatively small club of them. She said that once she sort of got the New Artist Grammy, people like Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift and Sabrina Carpenter all reached out to her and were like, this is gonna be really hard. And it's not that we haven't had people step back from fame in the past. Like, the one that always comes to mind for me is Meg White from the White Stripes, but Meg White was able to do that now because of the way that everybody's able to record everyone at all times and the way that fandom has gotten like really intense. All of the things that she's been posting to her social media have basically been just begging people who consider themselves her fans to sort of treat her like a person. And this is something that other artists have talked about. Taylor Swift, there's a sort of famous video of her saying, like, I sometimes really struggle with feeling like a person. And I don't think that we realize what the internet and social media has sort of done to people who are famous.
And kind of, and genuinely, because so the joking aside about sort of generationally not getting this, and there's a real risk generationally not getting it. So she is 26, gay woman, massive star. Is the issue that's for her that there's a kind of personal nature to the way in which you communicate on social media, you know, that's different? Because I'm sure there'll be many people over decades who say, well, this is what fame is like. It's really intrusive.
Yeah, so I mean, we're sitting in Abbey Road Studios. I really think that to people like her and people like Taylor Swift, Beatlemania would like seem quite quaint. It's the sort of lack of anonymity in every aspect of your life. People know your face from watching it on social media, and this is also happening, remember, at the same time that the music industry makes it harder, it's become harder for artists to make a living. So some of the things that they have to do is decide how much of themselves and how much of their personal life to monetize. This is something that lots of indie artists talk about, like Tegan and Sarah. There's a great discussion between Tegan and Sarah and the band Moona that I was listening to recently, where they just like have to grapple with this idea of monetizing their privacy, basically. More money, or money that actually lets them make a living being an artist, or sort of retaining a level of privacy.
So hold on, so what we're saying, or what you're saying, if I get it right, Katie, is there is a story here that we could easily miss, which you dismiss as a celebrity story, you might dismiss as a kind of music story, but it's actually about the extent to which people in the public eye choose to have a private life in the social media age. That she is calling out a need not to be a public persona and not to be as intimate on social media, and that's become normalized and it shouldn't be. Chloe, what do you think?
I think it's interesting. As journalists, we're always trying to persuade people to open themselves up to us and tell us their private stories. But at the same time, we're also aware of the fact that we have this obligation to say to people, you don't get it now, but when you do this and we print it online, there's going to be a footprint there that could potentially change your life. And we have to tell people that and warn them. I don't know if there's anybody doing that for young stars today. Maybe you just want to make great music and there's nobody sitting there warning you, this is what it's going to be like. Just, bear in mind, if you get what you want, things are going to change and maybe your life will just never be the same. So I wonder if that's watching what she has to say might be a warning to other people.
Oliver, what do you think?
There is something peculiarly cruel and unremitting about publicity in the age of social media. It's very common for young people to say things online and for it to be maintained permanently that they might later regret. Indeed, some of us in advanced middle age have had this experience as well. And they need to be aware, first, of the danger, and second, that there's not a great deal you can do about it once it has taken place. And the difficulty lies in many people dream of attaining fame, but the attainment of fame may in itself not be enjoyable and may be very cruel. And it's not specific to the digital age. It's intensified in the digital age, but it's, I hate to sound pretentious, but it's part of modernity. Emile Durkheim, at the end of the 19th century, resurrected the notion of anomie, the sense of being without norms, of being cast adrift in society, being separate from mores. And there's no way you can really avoid that in modernity, because modern society, increasing wealth, generates expectations which people strive to fulfill. One outcome of this particular story, which I've read about, as I was not aware of her name beforehand, is she has sought to stand back from the public eye because of concerns about her mental health. There is a lot of discussion in public about anxiety disorders, about depressive disorders, and sometimes the sheer fluctuation, the normal fluctuation of mood is perhaps over-medicalized. Everyone goes through low moods. To the extent that some critics refer to this as a first world problem. It's not anything like as damaging as some of the issues we're going to be talking about later, war and want and hunger. But it is, if it is an error in public discourse, it is, in my view, an error very much on the right side. It is right to be concerned about people's mental welfare and mental stability, and there is such a thing as depressive disorder, there is such a thing as generalized anxiety disorder, and we should be extremely sympathetic to people who fear that they are suffering under these conditions and point them to clinically validated treatments for them.
Katie, is there not a lesson in this story that is, if you like, for everyone, which is be careful what you want? Not, I mean, just in terms of fame, but the authenticity of social media posts.
I don't want fame, for the record.
No, but what I'm talking about is the way in which people now communicate. So Oliver and I, forgive me, Oliver, I'm kind of bundling you in here, but we didn't grow up with an idea that we would post messages on the media from our bedrooms. That it was like impossible to imagine that, and it seems to me as though actually being quote unquote authentic has a real currency to it, and then what you do is you draw people into your lives only to discover actually you want them out of it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about her and the thing about lots of people who are artists is they don't do that. They don't want to be famous. They want to be artists, right? Like, there's a difference between her and someone who's a social media influencer, and like that is their entire currency. That definitely is something that exists, but I think it's like how it's hard to imagine like what it would be like being a member of the royal family. It's this level of fame that is so unimaginable, and you also can't taste it. You can't know about it until you're in it. And that level of fame is so much more unlivable now, I think, than it was back in the day. Because there's a million iPhone cameras pointed at you every place you go. Because there's a million pictures of you online at all times, and everybody is spreading lies about you. She said that she thinks she feels about her body completely differently than she did before she became really famous, and that it kind of feels like a second puberty, like going through puberty again, which is horrifying. And yeah, I just can't imagine wanting to put yourself through that. I mean, she doesn't.
Or, yeah.
Let me give you very briefly a comparable anecdote from some years ago. It was when you were editor of the Times, James, because we wrote a leader about it. Justin Bieber visited the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, and he left a comment in the visitor's book that ran, I'm really impressed with visiting this house. Anne Frank was very brave. Hopefully she would have been a belieber, which was the jargon term for followers of Justin Bieber. There was a certain amount of outrage at the crassness of his comment, interjecting his own personality into this historic tragedy and historic crime. The argument that the Times made at the time was, cut him some slack, he is referring to something that he has found out in terms that make sense to him. Don't do him over in media commentary, yet in social media, almost certainly, he would be at this stage, and that would be a mistake.
Can I clarify something? Are you saying that when James was the editor of the Times that you wrote a leader about Justin Bieber at the Anne Frank house?
I had to persuade him, but
Do you want to
come back on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's move to the Middle East. Chloe, October 7th, October 8th.
Yes. The fact that it's been a year, it is really worth taking stock with this war that is ongoing and has no end in sight, of the wins and losses so far. So I thought I'd start with Hamas. October 7th, what was their goal? I would argue that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas's goal, was a suicide mission to disrupt the status quo and prevent the normalization of the Palestinian situation. He breached a border, he murdered 1,200 Israelis, took 250 people hostage, and the result has been that 10% of the Gazan population has been killed, is injured or missing, and 90% have been displaced. But I would argue that he would consider it a win, because he has most certainly prevented the normalization of the Palestinian situation, put the Palestinian question back on the map, and prevented Israel from making further peace with Arab and Gulf states. So I think Yahya Sinwar would consider October 7th a win, however unpalatable that is for us. And then Israel's goals. What were Israel's goals on October 7th or October 8th when it took its decisions about what it was going to do next? I mean, its said goal was first and foremost to destroy Hamas. They have certainly massively weakened the organization. They've killed its military leader, Mohammed Deif, and others. But Yahya Sinwar is still alive in the tunnels of Gaza. The second goal was to release the hostages. They have released some, but there are still 100-odd hostages left, we think, in Gaza, 50% of which we think are still alive. And the only way to get them out is a ceasefire deal, and that's not going to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to sign any kind of ceasefire deal. And, this, I think, is a really good time to remember President Biden's advice right at the very beginning, just after October the 7th. He warned Israel. He said, yes, this is a moment for you to want and require justice for what's been done to Israelis, but don't be consumed by rage in the way that we were after 9/11. Don't fall for the same mistakes we did. He didn't specifically mention the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was very clear that's what he was pointing to. Entering a war without an exit strategy. And I would argue, certainly, Israel is flexing its muscles all over the place, now in Lebanon and possibly with Iran, without proper exit strategies. It's just going out, all out to defeat its enemies without any clear plan. And I would say that this is a 1967 moment, which is quite a big thing to say, but I feel like the lines in the Middle East are being redrawn right now. It's there's a kind of a strange moment where Israel is both shrinking. It's shrunk for its population. 60,000 people have been displaced from the north. There's a huge swathe of the country in the north which is uninhabitable at the moment. And at the same time, it's spread itself, weakened itself militarily. It is now occupying Gaza. It's the occupying force. It's distributing food and aid there. And I would argue it's very, very likely that it will be occupying southern Lebanon soon too.
So Chloe, let's just go through. You said when you introduced it that we don't like anniversary stories, and I don't really, because nothing actually happened a year on. The reason you're saying, and also I should say, I think that there's a risk with those kinds of stories that what you do is that you sort of catalogue events and you tell people things that they already knew. What you did say, though, was something that people don't necessarily know, which is it's 1967, i.e. the map is redrawn. If you want to lead the news on that idea, then I think you need to explain how it's redrawn. What would you say is the permanent shift in the way in which the lives of the Middle East have changed?
I don't see Israel pulling out of Gaza anytime soon. I think that is now a de facto occupation of Gaza for the foreseeable future. There was massive discussion straight after October 7th of what will the day after be like. And really quite quickly, Israel was saying there will be no day after. It's not going to work like that. We were saying who will take over governance of Gaza? There will be no taking over governance of Gaza, at least for the time being. Israel is going to be occupying Gaza. And I think the same probably in southern Lebanon. I think that they will argue that there's been a UN peacekeeping force there that has been completely ineffective for decades, that the government of Lebanon has ceded any kind of authority over the south of the country, and that in order to protect its citizens, it needs to reoccupy the south of the country.
Oliver, what do you think?
Yes, I largely agree with that assessment. I would demur on whether it should be the head of the news story for precisely the reason you raised, James. I don't think that anything much has changed from the initial highly pessimistic prognosis. It's certainly been, on the face of it, politically, diplomatically, extremely damaging for Israel, both because of the initial catastrophe, or first because of the initial catastrophe. As Chloe said, there are still 100 hostages unaccounted for, maybe 50 of whom are possibly still alive. The initial assault to attack Hamas, I believe, was certainly a just and necessary campaign, subject to two provisos. First, to allow unstinting humanitarian pauses, to allow aid to get to Gaza civilians, and second, for the Israeli Defense Force to voluntarily take on risks in the pursuit of Hamas that would endanger themselves in order to, so far as possible, protect Palestinian civilian lives. It's not easy to do when you have a terrorist group that embeds itself in civilian areas, but it is a cardinal point of a just military campaign to fight jus in bellum, jus ad bello. And it has not been like that at all. The assault on Hezbollah and into southern Lebanon in recent days, again, you can justify it on all sorts of strategic grounds. As Chloe said, the southern Lebanon, below the Litani River, it's supposed to be, under a UN Security Council resolution, cleared of fighters apart from Lebanese forces and UN peacekeepers. It's not been observed at all. So Israel has a strong strategic case, but it has pursued it in a way that has been heedless of Palestinian civilian lives and heedless of the fissures that it has created within Israeli society and the Western Alliance. And this is extremely disturbing.
And what do you say, Chloe, there are voices in Israel who I think would take a different view, which would say, yes, it may be the case that there's the IDF in Gaza, and it may be the case there's going to be the IDF in some form or other in southern Lebanon, but if you stand back and look at the picture, Israel was shattered by what happened on October the 7th and traumatized by it. One of the traumas was its belief in its own capacity for defense and intelligence. And I heard a phrase last week which was the return of the myth, the return of the idea of Mossad, Shin Bet, the Israeli Defense Forces as a powerful military force. What do you say to people who say, actually, a year on, the interpretation that's possibly not a popular one around the world, but certainly is within Israel, is that Israel was rocked, was shattered by what happened on October the 7th, but it has regained its determination militarily and strategically, and has taken out the leadership of Hezbollah, has taken out much of the leadership of Hamas, and is fighting a war, but in terms of its own war aims, progressing those.
I would argue that October the 7th and this current war are the result of the fact that there are these two different warring sides that have been at loggerheads for decades now. And on both sides, they are led by fantasists. There is a fantasy in Israel, which has been really championed by Netanyahu, that the Palestinian question can just go away very quietly. And on the other side, you've got Yahya Sinwar, who's held conferences in Gaza discussing what do we do with the Jews once we get rid of the state of Israel. I think they're all bonkers.
Do you think we'll see a two-state solution in our lifetime?
I'm not sure that we can, or that we will, or that it's necessarily something that should be called for anymore. Maybe we need to go beyond that and have a conversation of a different shape, because two states hasn't got anywhere.
All right, we're going to park this, take a beat, and then we're going to turn to the Eclipse of Empire.
Eclipse of Empire. It is a piece of wordplay. It alludes to the preliminary agreement under which Britain cedes sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. I thought of it in astronomical terms because it used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire. With this cession of sovereignty, the whole of the UK and UK overseas territories will be in darkness at some point during the day. The trouble with journalistic figures of speech is that the moment you look at them too closely, they fall apart. And it does so in this case, because of course an eclipse is temporary and it is automatic, done without human agency. And this is not the case.
But Oliver, do you mourn the return of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, or do you mark it as a moment of progress for the UK?
I think it's a sane and sensible piece of diplomacy that acknowledges, without rectifying, a historic injustice done to the islanders themselves. I'm most interested, for the purposes of news, perhaps you see it differently, in the reactions that it is evoked in UK debate. You've seen a range of responses from many people, some of whom would be hard-pressed, I think, to find the Chagos Islands on the map. But for example, Nigel Farage immediately denounced it as America will be appalled, Labour has made the world a more dangerous place. Jeremy Corbyn hailed it as a milestone in decolonisation. I think it's neither of those things. It's a sensible deal that certainly it has played into domestic British politics by the fact that all the Tory party leadership contenders have attacked it, even though one of them, James Cleverly, was instrumental in bringing it about.
So I think, by the way, that is a really interesting story. What do you do with the story about diplomacy and dishonesty from our political leaders? Because, you know, Philippe Sands was kind enough to come to the KITE Festival and talk about exactly this. Not just James Cleverly, but Tom Tugendhat too. And what do you do when people are running to lead the opposition of the country, potentially running to be the next Prime Minister of the country, and you have the evidence that they privately supported in office exactly this deal, and then for reasons of short-term political gain come out and say they're opposed to it? What do you do about that kind of dishonesty? That is a story.
That is a story, and it very much bears commentary upon and leading the news upon. And Philippe Sands, I'm sorry I didn't hear him. I believe he's been counsel for Mauritius for a long time and has certainly written a book on this subject. But as an example of how destructive a failure to confront facts in overseas flashpoints can be, a lot of the criticism of the Starmer government has been raising, from the Daily Mail, for example, has been raising the prospect of, well, maybe we'd give away the Falkland Islands, maybe we'd cede sovereignty over the Falkland Islands as well. It's not quite such a knockdown argument as its proponents suggest, because, of course, the Thatcher government in the early 1980s, 1980, 1981, was attempting to negotiate a leaseback deal with Argentina that would have seen sovereignty go to Argentina. It was a perfectly sensible idea at the time. Don't get me wrong, the Falklands War needed to be fought. It was just and necessary to ensure that aggression did not work. The boundaries were not settled by force of arms. And yet, if we had ceded sovereignty earlier to Argentina, protecting the interests of the inhabitants, it would have been a perfectly sensible deal.
Chloe, can I ask you, so when I was a correspondent, foreign correspondent in China, I remember a colleague of mine said, there are certain kinds of stories that you do as a foreign correspondent. One is something very important that happened here a long, long time ago. And another one is, you know, that thing you've never heard of, it's not happening, right? That was an absolute stock in trade piece of China reporting. The Chagos Islands, how do you feel when people say, you know that thing that you've never heard of, that, as Oliver says, you can't find on the map? It turns out it's not a country, it's part of the UK, but actually it's not anymore. It's now going back to Mauritius. Is it the case that come kind of Wednesday week, we'll look at this Chagos Island story and go, what was that?
It's really interesting. I have heard this story. It's this really weird story that's been trundling on throughout my journalistic career. It just seems to keep coming up and up and up, and it just has never had a conclusion. So actually to see it concluding now, I think is important. For me, what's really important about this story is I think it comes at a moment when Britain really needs to have the moral high ground in order to be able to criticise countries like Russia and like China for its treatment of people. I think it's different from the Falkland Islands because we didn't displace huge numbers of populations from the Falklands. The Chagos Islands was a very, very clear miscarriage of justice. People who were already the descendants of slaves were now being, forced to move again away from their homeland. And I think if we're going to turn around and criticize Russia for its behavior in Ukraine, I think, handing back the Chagos is important.
This is really significant in that, in the context of the double standards argument about the West, and the argument that, the UK was going to countries around the world, not least in Africa, saying, help on Ukraine, and what they were hearing was, well, you're still occupying African territory in the Chagos Islands.
Rightfully so.
Do you think this is a moment?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned is that the UK displaced those people at the behest of my beloved homeland, which is bizarre to me. That's another part of the story, is that it wasn't even, the US their hands are not clean here either.
So the way the news meeting works, Oliver, I should say, is that at the end, we try and work out the hierarchy of what leads the news, and you can't choose your own story. So why don't you go first? If you were choosing, it's an odd choice between an anniversary of the October the 7th attacks, massacre, and the October the 8th continuation, or Chappell Roan, what do you choose?
Despite the intense humanitarian need and news about the anniversary of October 7th, I would go for Chappell Roan because it's something new and distinct and rather concerning. Obviously, the humanitarian disaster of Hamas's attack and all that has flowed from it is going to be in the history books for generations to come. But this is a specific story, and I choose that.
Katie, which one do you choose?
I'm just shocked that I got a vote. I think I have to go for the story about Israel and the Middle East. It's been the top story basically every day for the last year. I think it's hard to argue that it's not.
Chloe?
I will go for the Chagos Islands because I think it's a moment when, Britain gets to look at itself and look at how it defines itself and how it defines itself in relation to other countries. So yeah.
So actually, this is in many ways a perfect news meeting in that if you imagine that you're really sitting here trying to work out what leads the bulletin on the news, or what do you splash on a paper? If I was being generous, I'd say, actually, you could lead with any. They're all interesting and significant. If I was thinking honestly, I think anyone you choose, you're going to get a kicking. Because you do the Middle East anniversary, and there's a kind of predictability to it. If you do the Chagos Islands, it's one of those, yes, but where? And if you do Chappell Roan, it's like, oh, you're trying to get down with the kids, but actually, it surely is not as important.
26.
No, I'm saying
She's not that young.
No, but there's a kind of, the sort of dad dancing quality of news judgment. Sometimes you're reaching for an audience that's not naturally yours. So I think it's tricky. I have to confess, I would, in the end, make a call which probably runs Middle East lead, and the reason I think is you're framing, Chloe, as it's 1967, we've moved to a new state, a state of war, is a way of making sense of things. It's not all-out war, it's not the day after, it's an understanding of how things have shifted, and I think the news is particularly bad at appreciating cycles that are not daily, are not even monthly, but are cycles that over the course of a year the ground shifts, and I think calling it in that way would be the way to lead it. I would, strangely enough, then go second with Chappell
Justin
Roan.
Bieber?
We can come to that. There'll be a whole second news meeting special on the editorial writing process of the Justin Bieber leader. But I think I'd go with Chappell Roan second because I think that that's also a really smart spot, Katie, which is not just the celebrity point, but the extent to which you open up a vulnerability around social media and then come to regret it when you yourself are in pain. And the only reason I'd go third on Chagos is that I think that the real lead on Chagos is political dishonesty on the right. I think there's some real mileage to that. But the reason I'd have come third is just in the running order of things, Oliver. I think the fundamental and the really significant decision for the UK is acknowledging its place in the world and its need for partners in the world, not least partners in Africa. And I think that statement happened last week. So for that reason, I run Middle East, Chappell Roan, Chagos Islands, and that is the news meeting.